I took the medication. Just one moment. Look, I'll tell you what. I was sort of sniffling, you know. Look, I tell you what, the things I do for posterity, and you know, I wouldn't care to be taken before I finish this. Anyway, he'd led a comfortable life, and you know, fine traps and all that sort of thing, and he would have been well provisioned up there in Rockingham Bay. But when he got back to Brisbane, of course, he knew he was Commissioner for Crown Lands, but he knew very shortly after that one other thing, which nobody else knew. You see, if you go to Pew's Almanac, now Pew's Almanac, you know, they were produced each year. I don't know when they stopped producing them. But Pew's Almanac was produced each year, and it had, you know, all the details of life in Queensland administration and so on, and the names of everything and positions available, all that type of thing. And it was due for publication on about the 1st of January of each year, and reflecting therefore what had been so in the year before. And if you go to Pew's Almanac of 1865, you discover that there was a position in the sort of, you know, Surveyor General and Lands Department for a Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands, position unfilled, when at the time Pew's Almanac went to print. Well, guess what? The person destined for the position was none other than our friend William Alcock Tully. Now, don't tell me that Tully didn't know that when he went out to Charleville. I went out to the Warrego. And so, out to the Warrego he went. And he would have gone, well, shall we say, reluctantly, but I mean, his boss, Gregory, A.C. Gregory, the Surveyor General, a man of great stature, would have said, well, go. Because after all, Gregory was well and truly the boss, and if he said go, you went. Okay, then, so he went. But he had to ride 500 miles on horseback, there and back. I doubt very much whether Tully's bum would have welcomed that. Nor do I imagine he would have welcomed the fare. What would they have taken? Tea, flour, and corned beef. And if they'd met some settlers along the way, they may have not done much better. But anyway, and out he went, and he selected the site for Charleville. Now remember, this is going to be the capital of the Warrego, and Tully rode forth, apparently, with all of the Warrego available to him. He was to select a site for the capital. And he returned to Brisbane and he said, I have selected a site for the capital, Charleville. And so, where you are now is where you were in 1864. All for Tully. Tully never returned, of course. Now, it was a strange thing, you see, because 1864 was the year of the very great flood. And if you read well, you're lucky. You almost saw me in my death throes, but let's hope that not just tomorrow, the next day or something. Okay then, might have another swig. Okay then. Now if you read Mary McManus's, I forget the term, anyway, Mary McManus, 1913 I think she wrote the book, Recollections of Life in the Maranoa, and she has a section dealing with the 1864 flood. Which was a flood, a big flood, very big flood. And the evidence of that flood lasted a long, long time. Huge trees were ripped up, floated up, and huge trees could be seen in the tops of other huge trees all along the rivers. Dead animals, oh dear. Mary McManus's account of that is wonderful. Now Tully would have seen all of this because it affected every inland river. He must have seen this all the way along. He could have been in no doubt about the devastating effect of flooding in that area. And yet, he arrived in Charleville. He found a few people camped at we'll call it the upper crossing, that's Miller's Crossing, the Burke Street crossing. And he did the survey there. But he had the whole of the river to choose from. The people who were already there must have known a little bit about the flooding and the potential of the area. And yet, of all of the Warrego that he had to choose from, he chose what is now known as Charleville. Of course, he wasn't planning to spend a great deal of time. He got his work done and hot-footed it back to Brisbane because he knew that his days as a surveyor were over. He was going to the mahogany desk of George Street. And off he went. Well, he arrived back in Brisbane, never to return to Charleville, of course, and took up office as the Deputy Commissioner for Crown Lands. Well, that's well and truly when Gregory's problems began, because there is a type of person, and I'm sure we've all met them, the deputy who is upwardly mobile and who has a protector. And the deputy can cause as much trouble as he wants. He can do whatever underhand things he wants. He can be as obstructionist as he wants to his boss, because two things. He wants the boss's job, and not only does he want the boss's job, he knows full well that he's got the political protection a little bit above him, and so the boss is a little bit hamstrung about what he can do about him. And so Tully can be as insubordinate and as difficult as he liked, because he knew that to cause trouble was causing problems for the boss, but he also knew that he was protected. Gregory's problems began. Okay then. Well, the problems then began for another gentleman at the same time. Tully's immediate boss. Tully was the Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands, but the real Commissioner of Crown Lands was a man named Lamb. Well, Mr. Lamb, he also had troubles, because Tully was certainly after, ultimately, the job of the Surveyor General, but the immediate job he was after was the Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. Lamb had problems, and from what I read, it must have been that by 1866, Lamb had a breakdown, and Lamb resigned because of the troubles around him, it was said. Guess who, of course. A couple of days later, though, Lamb decided, oh dear, look, that was rather rash of me. And he said, look, please cancel that resignation that I've given you. Ha ha ha, bad luck for him. Because Tully's protector wanted Tully in the job of Commissioner for Crown Lands. Because Tully's protector, that I believe was McAllister, who was sometimes the minister, sometimes the premier, in and out of office and so on over the years. But you'll discover, of course, that Tully's promotion so often came with the promotions that happened to McAllister. McAllister was one of the most corrupt, even by our standards, one of the most corrupt creatures of his time. And if you go to the colonial newspapers, you'll find, chapter and verse of the things that he got up to. He was notorious, and I believe that it was McAllister who, let's say, Tully was the protege of McAllister. Tully and McAllister, you just check the dates and you'll find that McAllister goes up, Tully goes up. Within days, I might add. Anyway, trouble began in that department because Tully was on the way up and he had a protector. 1865, on the 1st of December or thereabouts, or 5th of December I think it may have been, he was made Deputy Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, so he wasn't sticking around the Warrego, that's for sure. By 1866 he was Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, and he was also then, with Lamb out of the road, The next one he was aiming at, of course, was Gregory. Well, he was certainly out for Gregory. And then Gregory's troubles began big time, because there was almost a war between the two, because this was Tully's method of operation. Trouble, 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 undermine, 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 and you aim for the top. And of course, ultimately, he did arrive at the top, and he became eventually Queensland's Surveyor General. But in 1866, he caused even more trouble, and early trouble, big trouble for Gregory, because he was made not only Chief Commissioner for Crown Lands, he was also made Under Secretary of the Department. Included in that department were the separate sections of lands and surveying. Gregory was head of the Surveyor General's department, and Tully was made head of the land section, Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands. Okay, but he was also the administrative head of the department as the Under Secretary, well placed in order to make trouble for Gregory. Okay then. Strangely enough, though, Gregory's salary was £700, I think it was, a year, and Tully's was only £500 a year. No matter about the salary difference, he was in a position to cause trouble, and cause trouble he did. Well, as we say, Tully probably never went to Charleville again, and he probably hoped subsequently, of course, that nobody ever mention Charleville again, although people maybe inconveniently used to say, well, maybe he named Charleville. Of course, ever so much, he was dead by then, by the time they started talking about those things. He died in 1905. And when he died, of course, he and Gregory died in the same year. When Tully died, he died in Sydney of a heart problem, was buried in a churchyard somewhere in Sydney, and to what I call brief obituaries. Gregory, on the other hand, was a great hero of Queensland, and oh, what a funeral it was! And he's buried very grandly in the Acropolis, if you like, of the Toowong Cemetery here in Brisbane. But Gregory was a great favourite. But anyway, he'd surveyed the town. There was a surveying of the town blocks, or surveyed the town reserve. Ultimately, there was a declaration of the township with the survey of the town, and so the people who were demanding permanence were able to buy their blocks of land, or buy the land upon which their improvements had been erected on the official sites then surveyed by Tully. And so you had the sale of 1866 when those sales took place. Now, if you read I think it may have been Claire Wagner who mentioned that the settlers demanded permanence, and therefore they sent a petition to Brisbane in 1866, praying, as they do in petitions, praying that the government might well declare a township and do the surveying which would allow for sale. Well, of course, this was also bullshit. If you examine the petition, there are all sorts of names there. Of course, I think 13 of them. It may have been 11, maybe 13. I can't remember. But this was This was a petition knocked up, and I think anyone who turned up on a horse was required to, well, not required, but was sought to sign it. The pushers behind the survey were none other than the Siemens of Roma. The Siemens, their hotel was not established on Section 1 on Section 2 and Allotment 1 until 1867. And they also had a shop. Well, this would have been that no, let me have a look. They had a shop there on Section 1 of Allotment 1. That's where the National Bank used to be, opposite the post office. But the people behind that survey were none other than the Siemens of Roma. And the Siemens had real interest in getting the land there. And when the auction took place, Siemens got 1, 2, 3 of the 4 corner blocks and the petition was all about the Siemens. It wasn't about anyone else. The Janetskys signed it, but they were only the pub keepers at that time, and I mean, the fact that they came to own the pub was a matter of another story. At that time, they were just down and out, probably fairly broke pub keepers, as Cooper had been before them, and as I think Brownlow had been before him. A poor fellow in Roma, another rogue, the rogues all seem to be coming from Roma, a fellow called Mazarath. But anyway, that was the the quest in the petition for, let's give us permanence at the crossing at what are now called Charleville. Okay then, so that was the beginning of that. And then if you go to Alan Morrison says, well, there was talk, of maybe moving the settlement down the road a little bit, and down to around about 20 miles south, down to around about Mangalore. He says the carriers won the day. Bullshit. It had nothing to do with the carriers, and there would have been very few carriers, because the carrying, I don't know how well it developed, but it was mainly a cattle area at that time, although Gary certainly had some sheep by that time. And but the carriers were not carrying cattle, I can tell you. The carriers were carrying wool, and they were not there in great numbers. If you have a look in that petition of 1866, there were no carriers mentioned. There were blacksmiths and carpenters and things like that, but no carriers I see mentioned. No, the carriers had nothing to do with it. It was the landed interests who didn't want whatever might have been promised. And so there it was. The Siemens wanted that particular Charleville site. He says the carriers wanted it, but not so. It turned out it was the big landowners who wanted that site. It was very convenient for them for a whole range of reasons. Convenient positively and negatively. And by the time you put them all together, the site was established by Tully, some people were settled there, they got the rights to land, mainly the Siemens, and then the big landowners, 3 landowners in particular, one Lawson from Gowrie, a fellow called Patterson, I think, from a place up on the Neve River. Very name I can't even remember, but I will remember it a little bit later on. Another fellow down the road there from Urella Station. Can't remember his name, but it'll come back to me. They were representing the big boys who were at the big meeting, the influential meeting, and they managed to get money from the government, which permanently set Charleville in place, even though there was talk of a rival place down the road. But you wouldn't know that today, because all of that was newspaper talk of the time and so on, newspaper reports of the time. And so the only thing you would know is that Tully came there in 1864. He had the choice, according to what you know now, he had the choice of the whole of the river. He chose that particular site. He chose it despite what he could see in the debris above him, and hurried back to Brisbane to take up his position as Deputy Commissioner for Crown Lands. And so the floods came. Well, I've got a list here of all the big floods over the years. Now, when I was young, in the 1940s, we had no significant flooding at all. It was a very dry time, because Charleville was a very dry town in the 40s. And, it was parched well and truly. And the only thing I can remember was green. Well, I can't even remember any green. But what I do remember, down lower King Street, of course, was nothing but galvanised burr. Footpaths were covered in galvanised burr. That the irrigation department blocks. The irrigation department blocks were all galvanised burr. I don't know, when I go there now, it's all like spring, very lovely. But no, it was a very dry time. And in the 1940s, you would hardly imagine great floods. It was almost inconceivable. The river came up from time to time, and we would go down to below the post office there, and we'd watch the river come up and, look for little snakes and that sort of thing that might have been with the flotsam and jetsam and so on that might have been washing up there, and we'd watch the river coming up and down. And the only big flood of a kind that you might remember is one that I'd remembered, It didn't. It was a big flood. It made a terrible noise, of course. And but the river water came up and flowed very strongly down the Cunnamulla Road. I remember we went down there, and you know, kids in those days, you could do whatever you want. You know, we just said we're going to the, you know, over to the Sandies or something, and we'd be home for tea, or but you know, there might have been snakes and God knows what not, but our parents didn't worry very much. Well, I don't think they worried at all. And when the flood came up and went down Cunnamulla Road, nor did they worry there. We went wading, if you like, of the river. I nearly went under because I was walking along the road, and you know, water up to my knees. But suddenly I found that it was up to my neck because it had gouged out a big hole. But anyway, I survived. There we are. But the 40s were a dry time, and the 1860s rather were a dry time too. And so, even though Tully had put this place in a terrible position, they didn't really begin to suffer from flooding until 1873. Then there was another one, a really big one, bigger than that, in 1877. Now, when I say a big flood, I don't mean that when the river was a bank. I mean that it actually invaded part of the town. And so there were big floods, and on they went. The first big flood that I can remember hearing about was probably in about, I don't know, it might have been 1954, 55, something like that. But the river came up and it actually flowed through our yard in Lower King Street, you know, unheard of. And I remember my mother sending me some photographs, and there was the water all through our yard, and so, but that's what Charleville has lived with. And who caused it? Well, you probably didn't think Tully caused it. Maybe you thought God caused it. But let's try to analyse that. What did cause it? It was in the wrong place. Tully's work. Why was it in the wrong place? Tully's incompetence. That's certainly true. It was also in the wrong place because of a bit of skullduggery that went on, but you wouldn't know that. But I'll tell you more of the skullduggery later on. And it also went there because of the vested interests of the Siemens of Broma and their demand for permanence where their improvements were, and some of the local gentry who found it rather more convenient for them, but I also suspect they were pushing for the site to remain at Charleville for negative reasons, because there was another lot who kept quiet who didn't want the township moved to a much more suitable location, which it could have been, and which the government was trying to deal with and trying to effect, because the government surveying work went on to this place down the river, but no, the vested interest didn't want it anywhere but at Charleville. And so if you're living in Charleville now, or were living in Charleville in 1990, you can blame the vested interests of the time, the skullduggery that went on, and Tully's incompetence. And so that's as much as I will do for the moment. I'll continue on. The next one I'll deal with, what were people at the time saying? And ultimately I may have time to reveal to you in the next one what the records tell us, and then all will become clear.